Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you are. My name is, of course, Mohammed Al-Taib, and I'm the founder of 2020 Vision. Today's the debut of our new podcast series, What's Happening Where. In this podcast series, we speak to activists, scholars, or journalists on events going on in the rest of the world, primarily world events that are not often reported or discussed in the mainstream media. And the goal of this podcast is really to get a full scope of why these events are occurring, and more importantly, why you should care about them. This episode is dedicated to Kashmir. Why Kashmir? Well, I'll let our guest speaker explain that. And I would like to introduce Danielle Khan, who is a special assistant to a special assistant at the Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. She formerly served as a special assistant to Ambassadors Swani Hunt and a program associate for Gender Equality Initiative and Institute for African Studies at the Elliott School of International Affairs. From 2018 to 2019, Danielle was a Turkish Heritage Organizational non-resident fellow, where she spoke on constructive dialogue surrounding U.S. and Turkey relations. She's an alumni of the U.S. Department of State National Security for Youth Initiative and a scholarship program that occurred in Turkey in 2010. And she's a strong advocate for fostering public diplomacy through international exchange programs. She graduated in 2015 at Tour Cummings Center for International Studies and the Liberal Arts with a bachelor's degree in international relations and global Islamic studies at Connecticut College. She completed her master's in international politics and human rights at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. And in her dissertation, she explained the persistence of patriarchy and the rise of violence against women in Turkey. She previously interned at the U.S. Embassy in Ankara and the Turkish Women Solidarity Foundation, where she develops surveys on sexual assault and assisted research on domestic violence against Syrian women refugees in Turkey. And she's also interned with the International Alliance for the Advancement of Children in Haiti, teaching English, music, dance, and art as a method of trauma healing to empower Haitian girls and women. Married to a native Kashmiri from India-occupied Kashmir, she's heavily engaged in activism for Kashmir rights to self-determination. She has participated in numerous Kashmir-related webinars advocating to end the ongoing human rights abuses and gender abuse violence. When she's not working on challenging human rights, she enjoys spending time with her children and visiting her home state of Maine. That sounds like a huge resume, Danielle. Thank you for getting into our podcast and being the first person to really introduce not only our podcast, but this topic.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. I really appreciate the kind introduction and the opportunity to speak about this issue today. And just one thing I want to clarify is I don't have children, but I do have a Pomeranian dog. And
Pomeranian dog.
She is basically my child, so right. Close enough. But no, thank you again. And I'm really excited to talk about this.
All right. So let's get straight to it. For people that are really new to the issue, where is Kashmir? Because when you speak about Kashmir, not a lot of people are, know where that is on the map. And more importantly, why has it really been a conflict between India and Pakistan for so many years?
Sure. So Kashmir is a region that's located between India and Pakistan. It borders both countries, and it also borders parts of China. And there's a long history, so I'll do my best to kind of explain it as concisely as possible. But basically back in August of 1947, India and Pakistan sought independence from the British and were partitioned into two self-governing countries. So princely states under the British Indian Empire's rule had a right to choose whether to accede to India or Pakistan. So as such, the Muslim majority states joined Pakistan, whilst Hindu majority states aligned with secular India. And during this time, Kashmir, which was a Muslim majority state, was ruled by the Hindu Maharaja Hari Singh. And this Maharaja believed that Kashmir should remain independent of both India and Pakistan. However, Muslim subjects revolted as they wanted to accede to Pakistan since they were Muslim and they better aligned with Pakistan. And so the Maharaja was then forced to take action because they were under pressure and afraid that Pashtun's tribesmen were going to invade Kashmir. So basically, he signed a temporary solution called the Instrument of Accession to India. And this was in October of 1947. And basically that was getting protection from India to protect any invaders coming elsewhere. And so as a result, this turned into the Indo-Pakistan War. Pakistan claimed that Kashmir should be a natural extension of the country. India claimed otherwise. So the United Nations had to intervene, and basically they established a ceasefire. And as we know today, there's a line of control in July of 1949 that still remains today. And so basically Kashmir is broken up where half of Kashmir is a part of Pakistan, and that side is called Azad Kashmir, known as Free Kashmir. And then there's the Indian side that people consider, or at least Kashmiris consider, as the Indian-occupied side of Kashmir, given the various human rights abuses that we will talk about throughout this conversation. So I know that was a lot, but I think it's really important to understand the history.
Right. And so like you have, like you said, you have two countries that are neighboring Kashmir, Pakistan and India. Why are their investments? Why are both sides really invested in this conflict? And what are the differences between Pakistan controlled or Free Kashmir and India controlled Kashmir? What's like a daily life like,
Sure. So that's a great question. I think of this issue as more about ego more than anything, because of the history between Pakistan and India and the previous wars and tensions. It's kind of like Kashmir is this little gem that's caught in between two, fighting siblings. And so to lose access to Kashmir is to kind of accept defeat. And I think so that ties into the ego aspect that neither nation really wants that to happen. But I also think it's a strategic region. It is an economic region in terms of, Kashmir, not so much anymore because of all of, the conflict, but it was an area where there was a lot of tourism. There's, natural resources. So obviously there's investment, at least from my perspective on the Indian side, as to why they want to maintain control over the region. Under the current administration in Pakistan, led by Prime Minister Imran Khan, the Pakistan government has made it very clear that it supports Kashmiri's right to self-determination. And that means that they want Kashmiris to have the right to choose whether to accede with Pakistan, to stay with India, or to be independent. And they are okay with whatever decision is made on that front. And so India has a different perspective where they do not want to allow that plebiscite. And I think that's because they're afraid that a majority, which from my research, a majority would want to accede with Pakistan. Right. And so I think that's also why they are so staunch on holding on to Kashmir. Now, in terms of the differences, I don't consider Azad Kashmir as Pakistan occupied Kashmir, because when you go there, you are free. I mean, of course, every nation has its challenges, and I'm not here to say that Pakistan doesn't have its issues as a nation, as we all do, as we do in the US, as an American citizen. But basically, there's freedom. There's no soldiers occupying the land. But when you go to Indian-occupied Kashmir, which I have been to many times, there's soldiers everywhere. There's numerous human rights abuses. People are staunchly oppressed. And so that's the difference, is that people do not have freedom, and they're living under really inhumane conditions. And that's not something that's happening in Azad Kashmir, which is why it has its name,
Right.
Free Kashmir.
And so recently, there's been a lot of surge of violence in Kashmir. And this has popped up a lot with a law that has been commissioned called Article 370. What is that? How are those two, tied in together in development?
Sure. So basically, what happened, and this was back on August 5th of 2019, was India revoked Kashmir's special status, which was granted through Article 370 and Article 35A. So basically, it granted special rights to Kashmiris. They were able to have their own government. They were, there was a protection where only Kashmiris could buy land in the region.
Right.
So it was unconstitutionally removed. And what I mean by that is the Indian government sent thousands of additional troops to the region, and then they cut off all communications. So internet, mobile phones, even landline phones, everything was cut off. And they removed this article without allowing a constitutional process where Kashmiris would have the right to vote and whether they wanted to keep these articles or not. So, and in order to accomplish that, they had all these troops and they cut off all communications. So Kashmiris didn't really know what was going on. They couldn't communicate with one another. Those of us in the US could not communicate with our loved ones there, but we heard about it in the news because it was announced in India that they had removed these articles. So it was just a terrible situation. And as a result of what happened, Kashmir was under the longest internet communications shutdown in history, which is so insane when you think about it. I think it was over a year that it was banned, and people, nobody is talking about that. So that, I think, it basically started India's broader strategic plans in Kashmir, which many view as a stronger ethnic cleansing of Kashmiris, because now non-Kashmiris can buy land in Kashmir. Right. So they can then go and settle there and start to push Kashmiris out, and more Kashmiris are being killed by Indian security forces because they're falsely labeled as terrorists. So there's just a lot of violence that's going on. But I would say that militancy in Kashmir has really declined because of the strong police presence by India. And actually, I think Kashmiris are feeling really suppressed and defeated. So I would say the surge of violence is certainly not a result of any Kashmiri doings and so much militancy, but it's at the hands of, Indian security forces who are trying to maintain control and start to begin this demographical change throughout the region.
Right. And speaking on that, what was the response of Pakistan, when that evolved, and on the ground, was there any rebels in Kashmir trying to, go against the oppression?
Yeah, so Pakistan's response was obviously to raise awareness about this issue within the international community as much as possible. And I think you might have seen Imran Khan spoke about it at the UN General Assembly back in 2019. And because Kashmiris on the ground were so silenced, because literally there was a communications ban, so they were under lockdown even before the pandemic happened. They were under lockdown. You couldn't leave. There were curfews. You couldn't move about freely without being questioned and sent back home by security forces. And people were generally extremely scared, you know. So the Kashmiri diaspora abroad and in the US really rose up and mobilized and were protesting actively about what had happened. And so the goal was to raise our voices as much as possible. But on the ground, I would say that everything was totally clamped down and stifled, and there wasn't really any space for rebellion. And I think Kashmiris were just so traumatized by what had happened and so afraid and unable to really connect with one another. I mean, people were literally afraid, like if they were like, if you were able to get access to a satellite phone to call your loved one overseas, which was like the only way to connect, you were afraid that like you couldn't talk about what was happening because you were afraid that security forces were listening to your calls and then could come after you. So I think that speaks to the level of fear and the fact that not much could be done on the ground. And I think we've seen that continuation now. People are just feeling really defeated.
Okay. And so when it comes to activism and your role as well, you know, I've seen posts where, you know, going to DC, the Capitol and everything like that to really urge action. What are obstacles that you face? Because there's a huge censorship that goes on. You know, even when we try to address this issue, there was not a lot of people we could speak to.
Yeah.
Just because of, you know, the censorship. So where does that also stem from?
Sure. So it is really challenging as an activist on this issue because we're dealing with a country, India, where they have a strong strategic alliance with Western nations, such as the US. And, you know, India is considered, you know, a strategic ally of the US, the world's largest democracy. And so it's really, really difficult to get congressional support to address this issue because it impacts the constituents of our representatives, because then they lose Indian constituents if they're speaking about Kashmir. The Indian lobby is really, really strong here in the United States. And what fuels that is there's so much disinformation and propaganda that the Indian government is fueling. And because of the censorship and because of the conditions that Kashmiris on the ground are living in, unfortunately, it has shown the international community that a false sense of democracy has prevailed, right? Because Kashmiris can't speak up. They can't protest on the ground. If they protest, they get arrested, they get shot and killed. They're labeled as terrorists. So nobody can do anything. And so the rest of the international community is just like, oh, everything is fine. And that's what India is trying to portray to the rest of the world. And as you mentioned, there's this censorship of journalists. So journalists are literally risking their lives to talk about what's happening, and they're being arrested. You might have seen that a very prominent Kashmir human rights activist, Karam Parvez, was literally just arrested the other day, and he's been booked under the anti-terrorism law, even though he's not a terrorist. He's simply a human rights defender. And fortunately, the New York Times, the Washington Post has spoken up about this among UN officials and the you know, international organizations like Amnesty International, human rights organizations. So that's good that, you know, they're raising awareness about this, but you know, he's not the only one. This is happening to literally anybody that expresses any sort of dissent. So going back to my point about the challenges is it just makes it very difficult to get support on this issue. I have been meeting with members of Congress, actually, because my own family in Kashmir is being harassed by police due to my activism here. I mean, that's the level of control the government is trying to have, where my husband and I have participated in protests here in the US, which is our legal First Amendment right.
Right.
As a result, the Indian government, the security forces are harassing my husband's mother and father in Srinagar about our activities here. And they're doing this as an intimidation tactic to try to basically get us to shut up.
Yeah.
And that's not okay. I mean, we can't have foreign governments infringing upon the rights of citizens and permanent residents. So I have been meeting with Congress to discuss this issue because it's not just about me, it's about all the other Kashmiris going through this. And that's why Kashmiris are so afraid to speak up, because you face these repercussions. And now I don't know if I can go back to Kashmir. And if my husband goes back, he risks being arrested or killed for no crime. So it's a challenge.
Yeah, so sorry to really hear about that. Yeah, that's really unfortunate.
Yeah.
You spoke on the fact that UN officials, Amnesty, nonprofit organizations like Amnesty, and have spoken on Kashmir. It's gaining traction. Has that really equal to the, has there been progress for the people of Kashmir?
So I would say that there's minimal traction right now because this prominent human rights activist was arrested. And I will say we did have some progress back in 2019 following this removal of Article 370. We were able to get some congressional hearings in US Congress to address the human rights abuses in Kashmir. So we were really pushing for that, the diaspora. And there was some significant progress that was made, but unfortunately that lost momentum because the Indian lobby is so aggressive here. And then on top of that, the pandemic happened. I mean, there were just so many different things where, not much came of it, unfortunately. And so I would say the traction is minimal and nowhere near enough where it needs to be. And it's sad, right? Because this situation has happened with this, Kashmiri human rights defender. And it's like, oh, great. Like New York Times and Washington Post and these organizations are covering it. And it's like, thank God, this has happened just so that we can use this to further advance our case. And that's so sad that it's like, we have to, use bad things to advance our cause. And, he's one of so many that have been arrested. And it's just, at least his case is being raised, but think of all the people who are not getting that. So there definitely needs to be far more traction on this issue from the international community. And, the US has just, they didn't even list India as a country of concern with regards to abuses against religious minorities. And there's just so much evidence of that happening, not just in Kashmir, but, against Muslims and, other religious minorities across India. And it's like, you feel like, how much more do we have to say? How much more evidence do we have to give for something to be done for these people?
Right. And so what advice can you really provide for those wanting to support the movement on the ground correctly? There's a lot of activism that goes around for events going on in the world, but how do you directly do something correct and not take away from the cause?
Sure. I really like how you worded that question, because I think there's always a great responsibility as an activist. And for the record, I'm a non-Kashmiri. I'm just married to one. And so especially as a white Westerner, I have a particular sense of privilege when talking about these issues. And I never want to speak for Kashmiris, but I think because Kashmiris on the ground, they're just so suffocated that they need people speaking up for them and raising awareness about this issue. So my advice would be, if anybody can get involved and begin to raise awareness, but more specifically, if you can call your local representatives and talk to your local representative and say, look, I've heard about what's going on in Kashmir. This is a concern of mine. I want to express these concerns. That's a starting point. because we really need to put pressure on the government here to start investigating and to start doing something about it. And I specifically say this for any members of the Kashmiri diaspora that might be listening. It's especially important for them to speak up, even though I understand that they're afraid, but there's, strength in numbers. If we can all do our part to raise awareness on this issue, it would really make a huge difference, because I don't think anything can be done on the ground at this point. And literally, I was just looking at my phone before we got on, and three boys were just killed and labeled as militants, right before this call. So again, that kind of speaks to the fact that nobody can speak up on the ground, because you literally are risking your life. So we have to do whatever we can here in the US, and as many non-Kashmiris that we can get interested in this issue and speaking up and going to protests and talking to Kashmiris directly and hearing their perspectives and helping elevate their voices is just incredibly important.
Right. Well, I'd like to really thank you for your time and giving us a really, deep context of what's going on in such a short amount of time. We really thank you, Danielle, and really appreciate everything you're doing. We're a platform that really seeks activism, pushes people to really, do something about the world events. And I'm sure this debut episode of What's Happening Where will get people going. Yeah, thank you so much.
No, thank you again. And it's, young people like yourself that take the time to do this, that really are the global change makers that we exactly need to be talking about these issues. So thank you so much for your time and efforts. And I look forward to tuning in to more of your podcasts.
Yeah. And thank you for those that watched this episode. And if you'd like to ask more questions or get involved, please let us know. We'll get you to the right people. Thank you for tuning into our first episode, and we hope you have a great day.
Thank you.